Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I'm going to be reading or looking at The Religion of the Greeks and Romans by Karl Kerenyi, reading, as I always do, some sections of the book and talking about them. This book is from 1962, and as far as I can tell, it was originally written in German and was published in both German and English around simultaneously. It seems as though it was copyright 62, released in 63, both German and English versions. The English translation by Christopher Holm is obviously the one that I'm working from. It's a pretty good and pretty complex book about Greek and Roman religion. Karl Kerenyi, the author, is a very well-known scholar of Greek religion. He is a student and contemporary, well, I guess not necessarily contemporary, he lived later, but I don't think he was dramatically younger than Carl Jung, and so Jung influences his approach to mythology, which I think is pretty interesting. I'm a big fan of Carl Jung myself, and this book is pretty good, but like I said, it's challenging. It seems as though I'm not the only one who found it challenging. But I did find it rewarding. And I actually have read this book twice, which I don't like to do. I have so many books on my shelves that need to get read. I wonder if I'll ever be able to read in my entire lifetime all the books I have on my shelves that I want to read. So I tend to really not like reading things twice. But I really wanted to review this, and I read it like 8 months ago or so. Did not mark off sections that I wanted to talk about. Because at that time I was starting to think, well, maybe I'm not going to cover this in the podcast, but I decided to cover it, so I went back and I read it again. Given the fact that I found it challenging the first time, I thought maybe a second read-through is going to help me grasp this a little better, and it did. And I picked off the sections that I wanted to discuss. There are three main sections here I want to talk about. The first of which is the shortest, and is going to kind of set us up for the second. The first one is going to talk about sort of the Greek. So this is about Greece and Romans, but it tends a little bit more to focus, I think, on the Greeks than on the Romans, but not that much. Obviously, the Roman religion draws a lot from the Greeks, and so I think it's fair to say that a good exposition of the Greek religion is going to give us a pretty solid foundation for talking about the Roman religion, although the two are not the same. That's the case that he makes in this book, is the differences between the two. I don't really want to talk all that much about the differences between the two. I was going to, but then I just decided there's a lot of stuff I want to cover, and so suffice to say, I'm going to talk more about the Greek approach, which carries over to great extent into the Roman approach. So the first part I want to talk about, he's going to talk about a sort of transparency of the world and being able to see a divine archetypal structure behind natural reality. So looking at the natural world and seeing behind it something transcendent. The second part will talk about some of the qualities of Greek thought that relate to their religious dispositions. And then the third part is by far, I think, the longest part, although the second part is going to be pretty long too, because I'm going to cover a number of different concepts. But then the final part will talk about death and how the ancient Greeks and how in the ancient world, how death was perceived. And so let me just go ahead and jump right in. Like all of my podcasts, I'm going to be reading a significant portion of the book, or not. I mean, not like 50 pages or anything, but in these three parts, I'm going to get in and read, a couple pages on all of them. The first part I'm going to read is like about a page. The second part and the third part both probably add up to about 5 pages that I'm going to read out loud and then I'm going to talk about. I mean, I'm not an expert in this content, so I feel like the best and most appropriate thing for me to do is simply read it so you can get it straight from the horse's mouth. of what Kerenyi is saying, and then I'll do my best to interpret that for the lay people, of which I am one, and of which I presume my audience is also comprised. So, jumping right in, let's look at the section that I wanted to read from, this is chapter 4, when he talks about this sort of transparency of the world that is so critical to ancient religious thought. So in this section, he says, quote, "The appearance of the gods in person befits a more festive world. It is the privilege and consequence of the festive atmosphere generated by poetry, and in characteristically Greek fashion signifies a complete transparency, a transparency through which eternal forms are seen. For Homer, appearances of the gods are possible, yet he does not believe that such appearances are the same for everyone. What he asks for is perfect clarity. Thus Hera in the Iliad says, 'Hard is it to see the gods in perfect clarity.' Or, in the Odyssey, 'For not to everyone do the gods appear in perfect clarity.' Diomedes, for this purpose, must have the mist withdrawn entirely from his eyes. Achilles and Diomedes both recognize the gods. This is the privilege and consequence of a special half-divine form of being, the heroic form. But it is also the privilege and consequence of the poetic art, where the victim of events can detect nothing more precisely than the daimon, that face of the divine which manifests itself in human destiny, or a divine action in general. The poet, in virtue of his special faculty and his familiarity with the religious tradition, can name the particular divine figure which stands in the background. This could be laid down as a law of Homer's narrative art. For all that, everything brought about by the gods in Homer happens quite naturally. A great deal of an earlier, less transparent mythology was excluded by Homer from his poetic writing. His particular religiosity consists in this, that he draws on wholly transparent natural sources for his inventions, but everywhere recognizes the divine in what is natural. All his divine figures can be followed back to their ultimate source in the structure of the world. It is moreover a mark of his characteristically Greek religiosity that he always views the divine as a definite figure. The difference between the knowledge of which ordinary mortals are capable, and that realized by the poet, is the difference between a murky vision of every day and the clear vision of a festival. The festal world of Homer rests on a special knowledge in the poet, a knowing which is a state of being exactly corresponding to the transparency of the world. The transparency of the world allows the divine figures of nature to shine through for the poet, and for festive man generally. The knowledge attained by festive man, which derives from the mythological tradition but also animates the myth from personal experience, is the vision of divine forms shining through. The first realization of Greek religion, with which we can make historical contact, was the Homeric world of gods, and this world was also definitive in prescribing for future ages the objective content of Greek religion. This content was neither changed nor added to substantially by later ages. The corresponding realization of Greek religiosity, considered as a subjective experience, can be paraphrased as a special kind of vision, the visionary knowledge attained by festive man." End quote. All right, so what we see here is that in Homer, first of all, and I've heard this stated elsewhere, that in Homer, essentially all of the events of, say, the Iliad in particular, could be described without any reference to the gods. Like, you could go in and you could tell the entire story of what happened in the Iliad without any reference to the gods at all. And what Homer does is he looks at these events that transpire. I mean, with the exception, I think the major exception would be the talking horses. But outside of that, the events that transpire in the world are all fundamentally natural events, and Homer sees through these events the actions of the gods, so that behind what is happening, there's this divine play ongoing. The gods and their conflicts between one another and their objectives and everything else all kind of comes through in the world, but through essentially divine, essentially natural activity. There's not much along the lines of like, miraculous activities. So like when Achilles is going to draw his sword on Agamemnon when they're arguing early in the Iliad, and Athena steps up and says, she grabs him by the hair, I believe, or grabs hold of him and says, listen to me, sheathe your sword, hold on for a moment. And he follows her advice. Now, you could say, well, he just was going to draw a sword and then he changed his mind, from a naturalistic, regular perspective. And then, Homer says, well, that's what happened, but also Athena was there. So there's a transparency in like what's happening in the world, and then behind that, there's something else. Obviously, from a very naturalistic perspective, which I take in examining this stuff, I'm not proposing that there is a transcendent world of the gods which is acting upon the world, but I do think that these gods represent sort of the structural, and he even uses the phrase, the structure of the world. What specifically does he say here? He says, quote, his special religiosity, referring to Homer, his special religiosity consists in this, that he draws on wholly transparent natural sources for his inventions, but everywhere recognizes the divine in what is natural. All his divine figures can be followed back to their ultimate source in the structure of the world. So the structure, the basic foundation, the sort of building blocks of reality are assigned sort of divine status, set up as gods, and in these structures of reality, there's a divine play at work. Now, I think that we can, from a naturalistic perspective, we can still sort of philosophically say that there are structures to reality from the experiential perspective. You might say things like life and death are structures of the human existence, and those things are given a sort of divine status. And I think that, so I want to mention an idea that I had when I was reading this part, but also very much so in the next part that I'm about to read, where I see a sort of parallel to like the hearth fire, which in Greece and in Rome was this perpetual fire. So the hearth was always lit. It was always there burning, or embers that could be rekindled. The fire of the hearth was never allowed to just go out and be rekindled. It was always burning. And in the city, there was a central part of the city where government took place, which would have a temple of, or it would have a shrine of Hestia or Vesta, where there would be a burning fire. And new cities were founded. They would take a piece of that fire and carry it to the new city to establish the fires there. And so all these fires, it was really designed to carry forward the flame through time from one generation to the next. And so if you are in your house and you're burning the hearth, you're looking at that fire in your hearth and you're seeing it as the same fire that your parents were maintaining in the same hearth. Or if it's a new hearth, that it's the same fire that your ancestors had brought from a previous fire. And this was intended to sort of go back and back and back, all the way back to mythological times. Because the ancient past, in the eyes of the Greeks, the ancient Greeks and Romans, was the world of myth, right? It was the heroic age. So in this fire is a connection to the deep, deep past and the mythological world. And the fire itself is a divine thing that is the form of Hestia or Vesta, this goddess of the hearth and the goddess of this perpetual fire. So as people are, like, say, engaging with the fire and feeding the fire more fuel, or prodding the fire or whatever, like maintaining the fires of the hearth, as they're engaging in worldly natural actions, human actions, they're also engaging with this fire that is both the fire here and now, but also this sort of transparency where they can look at the fire, and through the fire they can see the depths of the mythological past. And their actions in engaging with the fire are maintaining the capacity to be able to see through that fire into the depths of the past, right? So their actions support the transparency of the fire. The fire itself is a sort of transparent thing. So with that transparency in mind, and with that human action to maintain access to this transparency in mind, I want to jump to the second section. Now, this section is from an earlier chapter. I want to say this is chapter 3. In this chapter, he talks about a few of the concepts that comprise the ancient Greek attitude toward religion, because the ancient Greeks didn't really have a word for religion. It was just so much a part of everything in their world that they didn't really think it was something that was separate from other things in a way that required it to be named. So Kerenyi looks at a few of the words that they did use to describe things that could be maybe adjacent to religion, or could describe their disposition toward the gods. Okay? And with those words, we can try to like draw a picture of how the ancient Greek looked at religion. So this is not in any way, shape, or form like a continuous set of quotes. I'm going to just jump in, and he talks about each of, I don't know what I'm going to cover, 4 different words or something, 4 or 5 different words, I don't recall, but at any rate, I'm going to jump into each description of each word and just pull out the parts that I think are most relevant and most easy for us lay people to grasp hold of. So the first of those words that he talks about is eulabeia. And so in regard to this, he says, quote, "The style of the Greek religion has one characteristic above all. There is no Greek word or phrase for religious experience as a special experience, or for the attitude produced by it as a special attitude. The Latin word religio does betoken such an attitude. Originally, this word, too, was not restricted in its meaning to what is included in the sphere of religion today. Religio once meant merely scrupulous carefulness. So we may render the content of the word, without necessarily referring to religious things. It only gradually became charged with the content of a special experience. The very thing, in fact, for which in most European languages there is no other word but the Latin religious. In Greek, the substantive eusebeia, carefulness, and the corresponding verb and adjective went through a similar transformation. In our texts, this change first begins in the time of Plato and Demosthenes. It was then hastened forward by the very circumstance that the Greek needed a corresponding word for the Roman word religio. The change of meaning was finally completed by Christianity. Eusebeia, in its original meaning, presupposes no special experience. It expresses a universal attitude, which it was a duty to observe towards the divine, but no more so than towards any other reality of human life. The reality of the divine is not doubted, and this reality is not feared in any special way. Eusebeia, as an attitude, is determined by the universal rule of life that in every one of life's relationships, and so in relation to the divine as well, one must guard against positive and negative exaggeration, against the too much and the too little. End quote. So that was what I wanted to say about eusebeia. It's a sort of carefulness, and just like the word religio originally meant a sort of carefulness and was over time became, like the modern, I think he says the modern word in Greek for religion is eulabeia, which is a development of the word eusebeia. And it means carefulness, and also I think it's important toward the end there when he says that eusebeia is an attitude determined by the universal rule of life that in every one of life's relationships, and so in relation to the divine as well, one must guard against positive and negative exaggeration, against the too much and the too little. I've talked about this before in dealing with the Greeks, the book The Greeks by Kitto, and also in Aristotle. This sort of middle ground, golden mean, not too much, not too little, a sort of moderation that seems to have been very important to the Greeks. Not going too far in any direction. There was a sense of being too religious, in which everything was ascribed to the gods. One lived in fear of the gods and everything they did. There was a sense in ancient Greece of being too religious, and then there was also a sense in ancient Greece of not being religious enough, not giving the gods their due. And it was that middle ground that was what people were expected to achieve. Now, when I think about this, it also makes me think of this idea of the tending of the hearth fire, where you feed in fuel. You don't put in too much fuel or not enough fuel. There's a certain rate at which, you're kind of like sort of achieving this balance. I believe that, that's the kind of the impression or the image that it calls up in my mind of like perpetually achieving this state of balance through minor adjustments in order to maintain this perpetual moderation. And in the Greek mind, I think it's not the way that we necessarily view moderation, like from a political perspective. For example, I think a lot of us will say, well, if you're like politically moderate, then you're just sort of wishy-washy and you're not standing for anything. You're just kind of like too afraid to take a position, and so you just kind of say, well, maybe a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And I think a lot of times it's seen as sort of squishy. But in ancient Greece, it was very important for people to achieve that sort of middle ground moderation, because that was a sort of state of balance in which, would put you in a position from which you were most able to perceive that transparency. Having that state of balance allowed for the fires of divinity to be able to be perceived, because it's sort of central. There's a centrality to the whole concept of like, what disposition you should have, and what disposition or what, I guess, the quality of transparency to me seems like it's achieved best in that state of moderation. So anyway, with that said, that's eusebeia. And then I want to jump to another concept here, nomos. Nomos is sort of challenging. It's often translated as custom or tradition. So what he says about that, he says, quote, "There is a much more important Hellenic concept, which would at once bring us closer to the real nature of Greek religiosity, if it did not itself first have to be explained through a correct understanding of Greek religion. The fundamental concept of archaic Greek existence, which thus needs to be explained, is the nomos. Nomos is at the root of the whole of Greek religion in historic times, both in its cult and in its views about the gods. An exact translation is virtually impossible. Nor could it be otherwise, since here we have something specifically Greek, something belonging to the Greek style. It means not only a continual regard for tradition in spirit, but something more, to keep what is handed down in steady conventional use. Custom and usage, by contrast with the nomos, are more unconscious and mechanical. Law and order are too rigid, too reminiscent of express commands, such as were never an essential part of Greek religion. We can take a decisive step towards the understanding of the original Greek nomos concept by recognizing that the philosophic term nomos, as the opposite of physis, nature, resulted from a process of reinterpretation and revaluation by the sophists. The nomos of the archaic poets and the older philosophers, Hesiod, Solon, Pindar, Heraclitus, even the tragedians, can be paraphrased in the words of Jacob Burckhardt. It is the higher purpose which rules over all individual being, all individual will, and does not content itself, as in the more modern world, with protecting the individual and exhorting him to pay his taxes and do his military service, but aspires to be the soul of all. I emphasize these last words because their metaphorical manner comes very close to the language of Heraclitus, and it was not that far removed from the myth itself. All human nomoi, writes this archaic philosopher, are nurtured by one, the divine nomos." End quote. All right, so nomos essentially tradition and custom, but what he's getting at here is that it's not adequate to just say, well, custom and he says custom and usage by contrast with the nomos are more unconscious and mechanical. So a custom that you follow unconsciously, a habit that you follow unconsciously without being deliberate about it, doesn't really describe nomos. Law and order are too rigid. They don't really express nomos either. There's a deliberate perpetuation of customs in order to maintain the past. Now, I think that this also, and in fact, I think this may have been the premise that really made me think about the maintenance of the fire over time. But it's this tradition handed down from your forefathers, a mechanism of behaving, the things that you do in the worldly life that enable the past to continue to the present and enable you to pass the mechanisms of maintaining that fire onto the future. So nomos would describe all of the things that you do in the process of maintaining a world structure that enables you to see through the transparency into the mythological. Deviating from the patterns of behavior is deviating from the ritual, and like the repetition of the ritual. These sorts of connections to the past are the things that enable the transparency, right? The engaging of the ritual, the sacrifices, the feasts, the things that one does, from the maintenance of the fire to all the other things that would be done in the Greek world, are the things that connect one to the past. And engaging in these activities deliberately, carefully, according to eulabeia, which is carefulness and sort of moderation. So deliberately engaging in this nomos, this custom, with a sense of carefulness and moderation, is the thing that enables the transparency to exist and to be passed forward. Okay? And he also talks about how it's really aspires to be the soul of all. And as Heraclitus talks about, all human nomoi, which is I think the plural of nomos, are nurtured by one, the divine nomos. So that there's a sort of an overarching divine custom which provides the impetus to the particular human customs. That's a little bit of a harder concept to grasp, but maybe the idea is that custom itself is archetypal. Custom itself belongs to a deeper, transcendent vision of reality. That's what enables and causes your particular custom, the customs of your family, the customs of your culture, to have the quality of enabling transparency, is because there's an archetypal concept of custom that overlays all of this and enables that connection. So, moving on from there to the next concept that I wanted to talk about was eusebeia or sebas. So sebas is the root word, and eusebeia is a development of that. And in this section, he says, quote, "A way of life distinguished by a special regard for the divine is called by the Greeks eusebeia. Its root is the Greek word expressing the highest form of worship, sebas. Here, if anywhere, we might hope to find a way leading through the phenomenon of this worship, called by the substantive sebas, to a full understanding of the specifically Greek religious experience. The etymology of the word group, sebain, sebas, semnos, the attribute of being worthy of this kind of worship, is insufficient for this purpose. The etymological root meaning is on the face of it fairly clear and certain. Sebain and sebastai originally mean something like step back from something with awe. The simple translation of sebas is awe. To arrive at a real understanding, therefore, we must start not from the bare etymology of the words, but from the whole phenomenon, an account of the experience, that is, in which its cause, too, is given. Opportunities of this kind are to be found in the Homeric poems. In the Odyssey, there occurs in 4 different contexts the sentence, "Awe takes hold of me at the sight." In no case can there be the slightest question of a mysterious secret force. The sebas is everywhere occasioned by something becoming manifest and present in an actual form, something by which its visible appearance is able to excite such awe. Thus, sebas was excited in Telemachus by the radiance of the royal palace of Sparta, by the pleasing presence of Telemachus himself in the old friend of his father, and in Helen, who discovers the likeness of Odysseus in the form of his son, and finally, in Odysseus, by the divine beauty of Nausicaa as it appears before his eyes. Gods and men alike feel sebas at the view of an appearance such as the narcissus, the wonderful flower which the earth goddess cunningly caused to grow for the enticement of Persephone, and to oblige the god of the underworld, a sebas for all to behold, immortal gods and mortal men. Sebas can be excited not only by the beauty of an appearance, but also by a picture of horror, when it is imagined as if before one's eyes. Thus, Achilles must picture to himself the dreadful state of Patroclus's dead body. The awe must penetrate his soul. When it is the horrifying condition of a slain man or a dishonored corpse which is being imagined, the atrocity itself need not occur. The awe of it is in the soul. Again, it is the present situation which ought to excite sebas in the Greeks. Does it not strike awe into you? Sebas comes from what is present, to the imagination or to the view, from a bodily and spiritual manifestation, for in true Greek fashion it comes really from both at once. In the visible radiance of the palace of Menelaus, Telemachus's inner eye sees the radiance never yet seen of the palace of Zeus. In Nausicaa, Odysseus beholds the beauty never yet beheld of Artemis. In Telemachus, the presence of his absent father is recognized. In the flower, the wondrous radiance of a divine enticement is perceived. In the pictures of horror and dread, there is a mental vision of dishonor, something from which the viewpoint of an invisible norm is seen as intolerable. End quote. Okay, so what are we working with here? Sebas is essentially translated as awe, A-W-E, awe. So to be in awe of something is to be filled with sebas. Now, eusebeia, or eusebeia, I'm not sure how that's properly pronounced. Let's call it eusebeia. Essentially means being in awe of the correct things in the correct way, more or less. So it's good or correct awe. And that's kind of the religious disposition, is that you should be properly in awe of things, of the divine. And he gives a few examples. He talks about Telemachus being in awe of the royal palace of Sparta. But then he talks a little bit later about how what Telemachus is in awe of is not just the palace of Sparta, the palace of Menelaus, king of Sparta, but also he's in awe of the palace of Zeus. So this is, again, that transparency where he looks at a real thing in the world, this real palace, but he sees through this palace to something divine, or as we might understand it, something archetypal. This like palace of the divine king of kings, like the divine king of the gods, through the material palace. And in Nausicaa, he says, in Nausicaa, Odysseus beholds the beauty never yet beheld of Artemis. So he's looking at a human girl, but he's in awe of her, and he's in awe not specifically and just of her, but he's also in awe of the divine beauty of Artemis coming through this young girl and being portrayed through this young girl. So there's, again, this transparency. So in seeing through the material world to the mythological world, one stands in a state of awe, okay? One stands in a state of sebas, and being able and willing to perceive this awe and being perceiving this awe in the right way. So according to eulabeia, according to this carefulness, not being in awe of everything all the time, but not being, never feeling this state of awe, that's the correct mode of sebas, so that would be eusebeia. Okay? And so, let's see, I think there was, there's one more important one here, aidos, and I believe that was the last one I wanted to talk about, was aidos. So, in regards to aidos, he says, quote, "The real world has several aspects, and offers various pictures of itself. The show of a disharmony within one of these pictures is aidos, for the one who was the unfortunate maker of the show. The true quality of aidos is explained not by the particular moral code of a particular station in life, but by a disharmony which can occur in every station and in every part of the world. As these parts come into conflict with one another, so aidos can be ranged against aidos. The Homeric poems are quite clear on this point. When Hector is waiting for his last fight with Achilles, the two old people, Priam and Hecuba, try to call their son back into the protecting walls of the city. The mother bares and shows her breast, and with tears implores Hector, 'Hector, my son, before this,' she means her breast, 'feel aidos, and take pity on me. If ever I gave you the comforting breast, remember it, dear son, and defend us against the enemy by staying inside the walls.' As Priam had previously sought to soften his son, with the picture of himself, the father, dead, his corpse torn and dishonored by his own hounds, so Hecuba's gesture calls up another vision, that of Hector in conflict with everything which a mother's breast is and stands for. That must arouse aidos in him. The situation is at the same time full of life and full of meaning. It makes an example for the intellect out of the living reality. The showing of the breast, the bearing of the body of an old woman and a queen, of the mother's breast, is here against royal dignity and noble conduct. But it is life itself, immediate and unvarnished. It is no doubt an example, also, of the particular art of Homer, which has earned him among all epic poets a particular esteem. It is quite superfluous to give any special explanation for Hecuba's action. Her gesture is entirely natural. Yet with it, through every code of caste behavior, an aspect of the world breaks through, a domain of the world which possesses its own order. The mother's breast is a fragment of bodily reality, and this, its corporeal nature, is what makes it meaningful, all the more so for exciting the bodily reactions of affection and shame. It is a symbol, in the sense of Goethe, who calls that symbolic which is an entire agreement with nature and immediately declares its meaning. And a symbol, too, after the fashion in which symbols are used by ancient arts, as abbreviations. As a symbol, the mother's breast indicates a definite world order, the world order of motherhood, and so offers the mind's eye also a convincing show, a vision. For this reason, a thing, too, can excite aidos, as does her husband's marriage bed in Penelope. It is the visible sign of an invisible order. It can, so to speak, be seen through. It is a symbol, not as an element of symbolism, but as a transparent part of the world." Shortly thereafter, he goes on to say, quote, "As the mother's breast is made visible, the invisible order of one whole aspect of the world shines through, and its showing is intended to call to the son's mind another vision, the vision of a hostility to that order of the world, which he is bound to feel intolerable. Aidos is worship founded on a convincing vision, yet it does presuppose the possibility of a revolt against it, a revolt against the visible world no less than against the invisible order, for godlessness, or disrespect for themis, is also a possibility in the world of men. If nonetheless in Hector, the aidos before the maternal world is not aroused, it is not because he revolts against this world order. There stands before him a still mightier vision, which arouses in him another aidos. To withdraw now would be a violation of a world whose order has made him the first among the Trojans, the world, that is to say, of manhood and responsibility, whose symbol the living hero himself is. It is this vision of himself in an unheroic situation which holds him back. I should be shamed before the Trojan men and women, so his words must be translated. What he actually says, however, reads more exactly, I am shamed before the Trojan men and women, and he has said the same thing earlier on when he takes leave of his wife. The experience of a vision or show as passive as that presupposed by aidos requires also spectators, a viewing from outside, that is, of which the active agents and performers in this context are the people who view. The persons or things before which aidos is felt appear as symbols. They indicate orders, seen only by the mind's eye. Not only the mother's breast and the marriage bed, but also the hero, who, so to speak, is shamed before his own ideal image, and the Trojan men and women who physically represent that order, at the head of which the hero stands. They are all symbols. A symbolically transparent world like this, which corresponds to aidos, is characteristic of the specifically Greek religiosity. End quote. Okay, so that one's a little bit longer and perhaps a little more complicated, and yet also perhaps a little more rewarding. So aidos is often translated as shame. And as I stated in the very beginning of that quote, one of the very first things that he says was, let me reread the very first section here. So now, understanding that aidos is translated as shame, he says, the real world has several aspects and offers various pictures of itself. The show of a disharmony within one of these pictures is aidos for the one who was the unfortunate maker of the show. Okay, so when there's a disharmony in the world, whoever has created this disharmony should feel a sense of aidos or shame. He talks about the scene in the Iliad when Hecuba, who is Hector's mother, doesn't want him to go outside the city of Troy and fight the Greeks. She's worried that he's going to die because he's going to face Achilles. And so she says to him, if you've ever loved me, if you've ever been, my son, remember what I've done for you. Remember that I nursed you as a babe. Respect our relationship, the relationship between a mother and son, and stay here in the city and don't go out and risk your life. And so what she's trying to invoke in him is aidos, a sort of sense of shame for his rejection of his mother, his rejection of his relationship with his mother by denying her request and going out into the field of battle where he is likely to die. She is so distraught. That's why she does that. She shows her breast, which is so against, as he states in the text here that I read, it's so against the normal order of how one should behave. In particular, let me see exactly what he says. He says, the showing of the breast, the bearing of the body of an old woman and a queen, of the mother's breast, is here against royal dignity and noble conduct, but it is life itself, immediate and unvarnished. So there's an order of royal conduct and dignity which would say, no, the queen does not bear her breast, right? The queen, an old woman, does not do this. And yet there's another order behind this, which is like a natural order of the power of a mother in relation to her son. And that order is revealed through this. That order makes itself manifest through this act. So it's like an order that is bound up in life itself and in biological life that transcends or comes through and like overpowers the order which would demand, that the queen doesn't expose herself like that. And so this is intended to, this like exposure of the deeper order is intended to bring about a sense of shame in him. But at the same time, Hector says, well, there's another natural order to which I am bound. aside from the order of a mother and a son. And that is the order of manhood, because Hector is the leader of the forces of Troy. He cannot, before his fighters and before the men of Troy, withdraw from battle. He's bound to that order, that natural order of what his responsibility is as a man and as a leader. So there's another order there for which he would feel aidos. He would feel even more shame if he were to defy that order and he were to say, no, I'm not going to fulfill my duty as a man. I'm not going to fulfill my duty as a leader of the Trojan people, right? So there's these conflicting aidos by these conflicting orders. And I think that it really powerfully comes back to the idea of this transparency. So when the material action happens of the bearing of the breast or the fact of, him going or not going into battle, there are deeper orders which are fundamental to reality. There's natural orders which are exposed and demand adherence. And aidos, so you might say shame. Well, why is shame itself this virtue? That seems odd, I'm shameful, that's a virtue. But the capacity to feel shame when disharmony is created between your actions and the natural order of the world, when there's a disharmony between what you're doing and maybe what you should be doing according to the natural order of things, that should prompt in you a sense of shame. And for someone who doesn't feel shame, they don't care when they violate the orders. They don't care when they disrespect their parents, or they don't care when they show cowardice in the face of battle. To be shameless is really the incorrect behavior. If you feel shame in the appropriate situations when the disharmony is created, then you're doing something right? You're adhering to the order. And then the last thing that I'll mention is a very short section. He talks about that order. So this order that I'm talking about, this natural order that kind of comes through in these moments, prompting aidos, is the order of themis. So in this section, it's brief that I'm going to read, but he says, quote, "Themis, in its original meaning, is not a proper name, but the word for a concept, the full scope of which will become clear as we discuss it. It is complementary both to aidos and to nomos. We have already given a general idea of what is meant by this. Its close relationship to aidos is supported by texts, some of which will be quoted here. Everything which in our idiom is law, morality, and custom was in Greece nomos or themis. Whether more or less religious is of no consequence, since nothing of this kind lay entirely outside the religious sphere. When the mother's bared breast recalled the whole motherly aspect of the world, an order of motherhood with its own demands, these demands were demands of themis. The use of language in the Greek is here quite precise and brings us close to mythology, for it could just as well be said that they were demands of Themis, a great goddess." End quote. So Themis is the name given to this natural order of motherhood and I would presume also the natural order of manhood. These natural demands and this natural order is themis. So maybe the decorum of the queen in not exposing herself, and the decorum of an old woman in not exposing herself like that, you might say that's nomos, that's custom, that's the tradition which is passed on and which enables society to function. These sorts of ongoing norms of civil behavior. That's nomos. Nomos seems to be much more involves the participation of humans to create and maintain, whereas themis is like a substratum. It's there whether people engage or not, as the sort of man-made or at least participated in by men order of correct behavior of queens and old women. As that is sort of broken open, a deeper order lies underneath that, the order of motherhood, the order of manhood, the natural order of the world. That is themis. And so the fundamentalness of that natural order of themis makes it so prominent in the world and so transcendent beyond the decisions and the actions of humans that it is brought into mythology as Themis, the goddess, which is who is one of the titans, one of the ancient goddesses. I believe Themis was the first wife of Zeus. It's a very ancient, deep, fundamental, primordial force. This force of Themis. So let's see what we've got here. We've got eulabeia, which is carefulness and moderation. We've got eusebeia, built on the premise of sebas, or awe. So that's like seeing, that relates to the transparency, seeing through things to see a deeper, transcendent, archetypal nature to things, which causes a sense of awe. This is that religious awe that prompts people to believe in religion in the first place. Oftentimes they just feel this presence of this divine presence. That's the feeling of awe. Then there's aidos, which is a sense of shame in conflicting with natural orders and conflicting with correct behavior. And then there's themis, which represents this deep natural order. Now, I think that was all of them. Did I miss anything? Oh, Nomos. Yeah, Nomos, the custom. So I think that all of those, part of the reason that I bring all of those up is because they can all be, in some sense, seen as foundations of a sort of conservative order. The idea that there's a natural order to which people should adhere to, the idea that if they don't adhere to this natural order, they should feel a sense of shame. If they do adhere to the natural order, they should feel a sense of honor, which, by the way, aidos as shame is also used to mean honor, which is weird that the same word could sort of mean shame and honor, but they're so bound up together that adhering to the principle of aidos would bring about honorable behavior. They all sort of act as fundamental components of a conservative disposition, I believe. And so as I sort of try to assemble a framework in my mind of a post-Christian conservative order, a naturalistic order, I like to look to these old ideas to say, well, outside the domains of typical Christian conservatism, where can I find some elements that would support the idea that conservatism transcends Christianity itself and is actually more like fundamental to the human condition? And in that regard, I can look here and see these principles that Kerenyi is describing as constituting the religious disposition of the Greeks, and see that they also prompt a sort of conservative order in the world. So that's all that I wanted to talk about on that regard. Looks like this is probably going to be one of my longer episodes because I still have to cover the last part. Now, the last part that I wanted to read is the longest, I think might be the longest, although I'm not going to break it down like with all of those different religious concepts. I broke each one down. I'm just going to read this whole section in one fell swoop. And this is from the epilogue, where he talks about death, and he talks about the Greek and the ancient disposition toward death and welcoming of death into the world. Now, death is made a deity as Thanatos, and the afterlife, which is very different than the Christian concept of the afterlife, is ruled over by the god Hades, and is really considered more of like a non-existence versus an afterlife. But it's a tangible non-existence. It's not so much like a non-existence that doesn't exist because it's non-existent. It's like a thing. So non-existence is a thing in the Greek world, and it's a part of the Greek concept of life and the deities, and it's a part of the pantheon, and it's recognized and accepted. I think that we in the modern world have developed an aversion to death in a way that we don't necessarily want to deal with it, and we even like set ourselves up against it in this way that we want to eliminate death from the world entirely. We find that mortality, even like just basic fact of human mortality, is somehow an injustice. And this is something that I think is really pushed by progressivism. It's almost a war against human mortality, so that if a person dies, the presumption is that somewhere some injustice has occurred, and our objective in life is to make sure that every person lives as long as humanly possible, and we're just like working on trying to figure out a way to transcend death entirely, even if it means like, transhumanism and making of ourselves like half man, half machine, whatever like sort of transformation of ourselves is necessary to escape from the bonds of death which nature places upon us. In that way, and in many other ways, I see progressivism as sort of anti-nature. One of the main things about progressivism which makes it anti-nature seems to me to be its deep visceral opposition to the idea that people die. So, in this rather long section, he says, quote, "A man, even if he were the only living thing on earth, in some sort of way would know that death was going to overtake him. The certainty of this is involved in every phase of life, however small, and in the structure of his experience. The idea and nature of death is one of the constituent elements of all vital consciousness. We experience and see in every indivisible moment of our life process something passing and something coming. In every present moment, we are affected by the feeling that something in general is passing away, and something else in general is to be expected, independently of what it may contain. The total extent of what is passing and what is to come, with the advance of the life process, is always being distributed afresh in a characteristic direction. That which is passing increases, while that which is to come decreases. The extent of what is present existence gets more and more strongly compressed between these two. For the child, the present is a broad, bright surface of the most colorful existence. This surface decreases in extent with each advance of the life process. It becomes smaller and smaller, more and more compressed. For the young person, the future is there like a broad, bright corridor stretching out into the invisible distance. But with every piece of life that is lived, there is perceptibly less room for life still to be lived. The livable life is steadily consumed, while life already lived increases. This is the direction of death. We experience it in the natural structure of every living moment, as a sense of an increasing difference between two lengths. The future shrinks as the past grows longer. Death is not just an empirical constituent of our experience, but it is the nature of every life experience, our own among them, that it has the direction of death. Death belongs to the form and structure, internal and external, of every life as it is given, our own among the rest. It is not a frame which has by chance been added to the picture of particular psychic and physiological processes, but it is a frame that is itself part of the picture. Without it, the picture would not be a picture of life. The modern philosopher speaks to us men of today in our own language. He remains in the realm of the subjective, and at that is not even exhausted. In every life, he ignores its spiritual content, which for an individual who sees life hurrying away from him with advancing age may well be of most value. By contrast with this philosopher, we may turn to a man much richer in the experience of life, Berdyaev, who says, "Suffering passes, the having suffered never passes. Victory may indeed be achieved over what has been experienced, and yet that experience is still in our possession as a permanent enhancement and extension of the reality of our spiritual life. What has once been lived through cannot possibly be effaced. That which has been continues to exist in a transfigured form. Man is by no means a completely finished product. Rather, he molds and creates himself in and through his experience of life." Yet, Insofar as man is a living being, the structure of his life corresponds exactly to that idea of the interconnection of life and death, in which this important natural component of life is to be found. Then, shortly later, he goes on to say, quote, "When the dying Greek invokes the gates of Hades, this is a picture, but not only a picture. It is also the viewing and naming of a reality. In particular, since an afterlife in Hades is not necessarily implied by it, nor self-evident in it, the reality viewed is that of non-existence. It is real because the impending non-existence of the speaker is an actual part of the world. It will be that he will not be. Nor is the god Hades himself only an image. He too is an actual god. Because of him, and in company with him, the other death deities of the ancient world, which do not guarantee an afterlife, but only the reality of death, we are forced to recognize that the ancient religious view, in its unreflective fashion, includes non-existence among the forms of existence, that it extends the all-embracing realm of being to non-being itself. It is rare for an ancient religious idea to be found in such exemplary form as here, where its content, non-existence, although really there for us all in the world, is conceivable only as an idea, and only in pictorial form, by the one who experiences and knows it, and only by him. There is a big series of Roman tomb inscriptions which describe the reality of death as a world of negation and privation, a world of evil, of darkness, of stillness, of cold, of ugliness. A survey made in the spirit of these interpretations yielded the following statement. The mythical view clothes even non-existence with a shape, and gives a form to nothingness. The Greek and Roman belief in immortality is almost always treated by historians of religion as if we had here to do with ideas about an actual afterlife in the grave or in the underworld. A mistake which, more than anything else, shows up the immense gulf dividing the ancient from the modern view. For these ideas are far removed from a belief in immortality. On the contrary, they are direct forms of expression of the human condition in death. The apotheosis of the dead, which we encounter in archaic and then in later imperialistic times, was something quite different. This, too, was a highly contradictory idea. Generally speaking, the state of death is described in the tomb inscriptions as something objective. It appears as a paraphrase for objective non-existence, the thing we are headed for as we move in the direction of death. These paraphrases have nothing to do with the capacity or incapacity for abstraction. The withdrawal of itself, which life in fact performs, was expressed by analogy, in terms of existence. It is quite in the spirit of Greece and of antiquity, when Plato says, non-existence, in some sense, exists. The language of the unreflected experience of life puts for non-existence death. Yet, death too has its place assigned to it in the Greek conception of the universe. Death and its domain are bounded. The world, which contains our non-existence, therein displays one of its aspects. Whether a monstrous, beast-like, or man-like, or even a motherly face, or only emptiness and cold and gloom, an aspect, at any rate, which we know and recognize. We know it from inside as a capacity of the world to undergo a transformation which for us is final. The dread of this change springs from the negation and privation which it means for us. And what makes it all the more dreadful is that it does not face us with the possibility that the existence of the world itself could be shattered, but only with our own reduction to nothingness. For in this aspect of the world there is displayed to everyone his own death. The death aspect of the world is, in a primary and immediate fashion, identical with the experience that the whole universe stands before us, but with diminishing room for ourselves. Some room in another world is not excluded by this knowledge, yet it must be more appropriate to the state of death than to that of life. We recognize this non-existence in the death of others, the transformation of those who have just died, which announces that they have crossed the frontier of Hades. is the external counterpart of that transformation which we all gradually undergo and experience in the direction of death. Our internal experience finds an external support and justification. It announces itself in that echo of which we have spoken. It is at the same time evoked and completed by the external experience, just as our idea of a fruit which we have known only in its unripe state is completed by the sight of the ripe fruit. Parmenides said that the dead body does not indeed perceive light or warmth or sounds because its fire has gone out, but that it does perceive cold and silence and whatever else is opposed to them. This cold and quiet, the state of being dead, is experienced by us only exceptionally. The dead experience it forever. In them, the world accomplishes and shows us the ripe fruit. Yet Epicurus too had right on his side when he said, "When we are present, death is not present, and when death is present, we are not." The transformation is so thorough and complete that anyone who has undergone it is no longer the self that he once was. Being dead means being quite other. The death direction is the direction toward the quite other. This quite other is contained in the world. It is a feature of the death face of the world. It is what distinguishes it, together with all the gods, which are its aspects, and every one of which represents a special face of the world, from mortal creatures. What makes the world quite other is just this quality, that it supports non-existence, lightly and eternally. While for living creatures, it is the occasion of the most complete of all their transformations, so complete that it does not even exclude the notion of apotheosis, that the dead may become gods. Yet for living man, the shock of the quite other remains, for it includes also his coming otherness. Here we encounter one of the fundamental elements of all religion, but only one among many. The idea of non-existence as a world aspect is only one among many aspects of the universe to which it is related. Just as in the idea of death, the reality of non-existence appears in one aspect of the world, its death face, so in the idea of life, there appears the reality of existence as an aspect of the world. If non-existence shows itself in this world as pure negation and privation, yet in this same experience, the experience of death, there accumulates on the other side everything that is positive, and the life face of the world comes into view. If all these positive things, light, heat, gaiety, sound, did not evoke the idea of life, then there would be in the world no mode of appearance for death at all. There would be no idea for non-existence. And not only that, if by an experiment of thought we were to think life out of the world, then there would be no longer any force or power left for non-existence. If we had not known life, we should never have experienced the power of death. It is only by life that non-existence has been raised to the rank of a reality, which appears in the world and is powerful there. The one idea leads inevitably to the other. Life makes the idea of death possible, even powerful, and the idea of death enables life in all its reality, its strength and power to become actual. As the room for livable life steadily contracts about every mortal creature, our first thought might be that the gray and gloomy colors would increasingly dominate his landscape, but it is rather the other way round. The contraction causes all the colors of life, all that the world has to show, to glow more brightly. The experience of this polarity may vary from one individual to another. The fact that it is experienced is just as much an ingredient of the structure of all living things, and consequently of the structure of the world, as the death direction. And it is not merely an external and literal manifestation in which the idea of life and the idea of death appear together as the colorful splendor of the world. It is an aspect of the world in which we can fully participate, without distinguishing between external vision and internal experience. To the slumbering and fitful consciousness of life, the idea of death comes at times like water thrown on a dying fire, at times like oil to stir it into a blaze. Yet this idea of life, the reality which, so to speak, blazes up in its fullest intensity under the pressure of death, is not to be confused with notions of another world. It is in essence, really, existent and irreplaceable. We experience it simply as life, undiluted by its no less real opposite. Indeed, we only experience what real existence is when we face the condition which is its total negation, the state of death. And this thing, whose place can be taken only by something other, never by something like, is in truth irreplaceable. The ideas of ancient religion, like the idea of death or the idea of life, are not only themselves aspects of the world, but also have various aspects of their own. We have only to consider in how many deities the life aspect of the world appears. And the negation of existence in death, the pure privation of non-existence, may well be repugnant to us in comparison with all the positive gifts of life, its feelings and experience. Yet life, too, can be so painful and agonizing that the purely negative aspect, the world of Hades, may appear mild and beneficent by contrast. There is a natural fear of death, and death is bitter for it. But there is also, just as natural, our urge towards death, which can build itself up into a longing for death. For this longing, non-existence is sweet, and the mild and beneficent face of non-existence corresponds to it. The bitterness and the sweetness of death are both realities. Poets give accounts of them as credible as those they give of love. Death was listed as one of the muses of great lyric poetry. This was doubtless the case, too, in the period we are considering, though we have lost the choral songs which were sung in honor of Persephone, the goddess of death. But the fact that she is beautiful, though she may also be the sender of the dreaded Gorgon head, should give students of religion food for thought. We should learn from the ancient artists and more recent poets that there is more in the case than a wish for some outward embellishment of death. Psychology and biology have arrived at a common conclusion, that there is not only a life instinct and the fear of death bound up with it, but also a death instinct. The existence of this instinct follows from the structure of the living creature. Life instinct and death instinct are nothing but scientific terms for the fact that every living thing is continually in process of construction and destruction. These two, construction and destruction, can be thought of as two tracks, one directed upwards, the other downwards, but both together coincide with the direction of death. Construction proceeds just as much in the direction of death as destruction. It really is only one track, along which the living creature moves, and no one could tell at what point the life of the movement begins to go downward. From the beginning, the track is a track and not a stopping place. It is the track of life, and therefore also with the slope of death. Life and death instinct together, inseparably joined to one another, make up the nature of the living creature. They are two aspects of the living creature, which could just as well be called the dying creature. In one and the same individual, the dying creature can even assume the predominance over the living creature, in advanced years, or in illness, or what is not the same in tragic circumstances. Both creatures, which make up the one living dying creature, have their own fears and longings. Fear of death and longing for life, fear of life and longing for death. The bitterness of death is connected with the first pair, the sweetness of death with the second. Both are possible because man, as a living and dying creature, is in continual structural contact with his own death, and yet has no direct experience of it as an actual state. Only the dead man experiences the state of death. However, we have the possibility of hurrying ahead along the track, which is both the track of life and the slope of death, and anticipating the end, not in reality, but in dream and imagination. But there is a reason, even for the anxious and wishful pictures of a dreaming or imagining mind. The reason is given by the track, which is at the same time a slope and has for its end an unwished-for, even terrifying break, which can yet appear as a longed-for goal. But however this end may appear to the anticipating soul, whether dreadful or longed for, the subject matter of the pictures in which it shows itself cannot be taken from death itself. Non-existence contains nothing. That being other is something different from any experience of life. Thus it is that even those fancies which make death seem pleasant come from life. the end is so imagined as if it were a continuation, wished for or not. Objective non-existence, realized in the death of living creatures, has appeared to us, as it necessarily did also to the ancients, in two aspects, as a dreaded end and as a confining framework for all living creatures, on which they begin and on which, just as naturally, they cease to exist, as if arrived at a destination down a pleasant slope. On the other hand, for ancient man, non-existence had another characteristic, different from those with which we are familiar. The modern idea of non-existence is completely empty. For ancient religious man, non-existence, as the enclosing framework of organic life, was both full and empty at the same time. It is not a logically bounded, exactly defined idea like the non-existence of the philosophers, but a reality bordering on all living things. It is only in its border region that it can be comprehended at all, for its real core remains the inconceivable. In its border region, however, we do approach this inconceivable. We do it by intermediate stages, just as we approach non-existence. Between the light of day and the complete absence of light, for which the Greeks had the name erebos, there is night. Before the fully formed state of an organism, there is the germ. As ground of every living movement, there is the resting earth. But where is the frontier between night, the germinal state, the earth in motherly repose, and a realm of non-existence, conceived as lightless, germless, and totally dead? We can indicate a domain of reality lying midway, so to speak, between the domain of wholly negative, pure non-existence, and the domain of total existence, containing within itself every stage and every possibility. This intermediate realm of all the small life that swarms in darkness is the bottommost layer in the great realm of life. As the domain of incompleteness and motherly protection it is not closed to the realm of non-existence. For ancient man, indeed, it was so much a part of this realm that non-existence itself was joined to it. For non-existence could not be conceived as a sheer yawning void, but only as completely and inseparably bound up with the idea of Mother Earth and as one of her aspects. Thus it was that the fullness of germination itself became an aspect of non-existence. End quote. All right, so as you heard, there's quite a bit there. That's a long section. And I really just want to draw your attention to a few points. The first is when he talks about the direction of death. And this is kind of like Heidegger's being towards death. Being towards death in Heidegger, it really seems to be like an awareness of this direction of death. But everything that we do is kind of guided by the idea that, well, I'm not going to live forever. I've got a limited amount of time on this earth. And so death is always present in some form or another in all things that we do, because it defines the fact that we're aging, we have limited time on the earth. He talks about how the collection of things that we've done grows, like the past, and the things which have passed away grows and grows and grows, and those things which are coming toward us, which are coming into being, the future events, gets diminished and diminished and diminished. And this is an ever-present fact of existence. So we live in this permanent, he describes it as a track which is inevitably going towards death. And so death is an ever-present part of our existence. He describes it as a frame around a picture, but it's not just a frame around a picture, because the frame itself is part of the picture and in a way defines life. So it's, even though we never truly experience our own death and our own non-existence, nonetheless, our own non-existence after death remains an integral component of our life. He talks about how, the life demands the concept of death. Death defines the concept of life. The concept of life defines death. These two things are so inextricably bound together. And like I said earlier, there's a, especially in progressivism, there seems to be a real opposition to the very premise of death and a sort of injustice in death. The idea that people die is something that seems to be we always need to be fighting against this and making sure that people live as long lives as possible. That we're going to do this, that, or the other, and if it saves even one life, then whatever we do is going to be worth it, because like saving lives is really the number one objective of human existence. It's just, I find it real strange and disorienting and unnatural to have this deep opposition to death, which ought to be something that we accept in our lives as inevitable and wholly natural. And I think that also kind of ties into some of the ideas of what people on the left tend to consider as rights, like this idea that, well, first of all, like you have a right to food, you have a right to shelter, you have a right to health care. These are all things, like you essentially have a right to life. You have a right to live, and all of the things which are necessary for life, you therefore have a right to them. For us to say, like, we have a right to food, we have a right to health care, and a right to this, that, and the other, presupposes us as being in the position of a caged animal and not in the position of a wild animal. Because in a wild animal, the idea that it has a right to be fed is nonsensical. But for a caged animal, to say it has the right to be fed makes perfect sense. So it exchanges its freedom for these rights, the right to be cared for, because it's not able to do these things for itself. So to me, like, in order for us to really be free individuals, that requires that we have like the right to pursue food. We have the right to pursue shelter. We have the right to pursue things in life. But we don't have the right to be like cared for and taken. And so this relates to this idea of death, that death is an injustice. The death of a wild animal is not an injustice. But the death of a caged animal treated poorly, denied food, that's an injustice. Right? So death is a natural part of the world for a being that has the capacity to pursue its own existence. And it just strikes me that we have become this society where we have so much of a sense of the injustice of dying, and the idea that we're really like engaged in a war against mortality. Like, no matter what we have to do, like the whole technological system in which we live is all built really in order to battle our own mortality. And it seems like when you start getting into the real nuts and bolts of like transhumanism, it begins to make the argument that, in order to fend off death, we'll do whatever it takes to fend off death, even to the point where, we replace our body parts with mechanical parts, in order, looking down the future, to take sort of a futurist approach to things. How much are we willing to do to fend off death? How far are we willing to go to fend off death? And to what extent are we willing to eliminate life in order to also eliminate death? Like, do we want to say, yes, I'm willing to become a machine if it means I live forever? It seems like there's this move to make humans into like immortal machines. Now that starts sounding like sci-fi, but the more we believe that we should not be bound by nature and by the limitations that nature places upon us, the more we begin to move into the territory of saying, we should not be bound by death. Like, if you're not bound by biological reality, you're not bound by your gender, you're not bound by pregnancy, the realities of, you have sex, you get pregnant, you bear the child, the biological realities of manhood and womanhood, and so on and so forth. Like, if you can just, get plastic surgery to become, this or that, whatever kind of person you want to look like, whatever you believe yourself to be is what you can be. Your body is just putty for you to do what you want, because you're not your body. Like you're some sort of soul that has a body, that then the body can be dismantled and replaced with a new body. And the thing that continues on is like this soul that goes on living in the machine. All of this stuff is like deeply anti-nature, and in order to be truly accepting of the constraints of nature is accepting the constraint of death. First and foremost, you die, you will die, other people will die, people will starve to death. Like that, death, suffering, these things exist in the world. And to some extent, it's good to alleviate suffering, but it's not good to completely shatter the bonds which hold us to our own natures in order to alleviate death and suffering. And the other factor here which has to be considered is, like, if you think about evolution and what it is, the evolutionary process depends on death. And not only death itself, but it depends on disparate rates of death. So inequality in how people die, in the suffering that people experience. Some people live and some people die, and some people are born with traits that allow them to live longer and be more successful in their procreation, in their capacity to raise their children successfully. And some people are born with traits that don't allow them to survive, don't allow them to thrive, don't allow them to procreate as successfully. This disparity between people's different rates of success and survival that's the fundamental nugget of what makes evolution possible. Some entities living and other entities dying because they have unequal capacities. That's what evolution rests upon. And the more we say, well, every single person born has a right to live to be, a full life, to be like 100 or whatever, it has the right to live to extreme old age, and any sort of disparity between some people dying young and other people, like that's an injustice. Someone dies of cancer at 30, an injustice has occurred. Something or something has occurred which must be eliminated from society so that everyone has the same chance of living to be 100 years old, and that chance is 100%. You have now extracted humanity from the evolutionary process entirely. It's a deeply anti-nature philosophy to have this deep hostility to human mortality. So I think that in my mind, part of conservatism is accepting death in the world, and part of the program of progressivism is battling mortality and eliminating mortality from the world, and eliminating especially disparate mortalities, eliminating people dying young, dying before they have a chance to have children. If it's a great tragedy for someone to die before they have children, then the evolutionary process itself is a great tragedy, because that's the fundamental component of evolution. People dying before they are able to procreate. That's like the nugget of reality that pins the whole premise of evolution together. So you're saying that evolution itself is an injustice, in which case you're saying that nature is an injustice, that we should be subject to nature is to say that we're subject to a natural injustice, and that we have to break out of the bonds of nature to build a just world. And then a just world is an unnatural world. And I think that's like a deep, deep problem with progressivism, and with our and it's not just progressivism, it infuses every corner of society, this constant struggle and war against human mortality. A healthy, natural mindset is one that makes room in, I should make room in my life for my own mortality. I should accept my own mortality. I should live my life knowing that I'm not going to live forever. And I also, especially, should not demand that reality conform to an idea in which mortality is driven to the farthest corners of reality. So anyway, I think I've covered all that I wanted to cover from this book. So till next time, thanks for listening. Bye.